speaker this evening, Jack Shitama, the Executive Director of Pecometh Camp and Retreat Ministries, where he has served since 2000. He is an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church and has served as pastor of churches in Port Deposit, Maryland and Chesapeake City, Maryland. Jack serves on the Peninsula Delaware Conference Vision Team and was a clergy delegate to the 2012 General and Jurisdictional Conferences. He served as president of the International Association of Conference Center Administrators from 2003 to 2007. He served on the United Methodist Camp and Retreat Ministries Association Board from 2007 to 2015, including vice chair from 2011 to 2013 and chair from 2013 to 2015. Jack is the founding minister in residence for the Pecometh Center for Clergy Excellence. He is the author of 3 books: Anxious Church, Anxious People, How to Lead Change in an Age of Anxiety, One New Habit, One Big Goal, Change Life in 10 Weeks. If you met my family, you'd understand. A Family Systems Primer. He regularly writes leadership development articles on his blog at the NonAnxiousLeader.com, and his podcast, the NonAnxious Leader Podcast, is available on all platforms. Jack and his wife of 38 years, Jody, have 4 children and 3 grandsons. Jack is an avid runner and has completed the Baltimore Marathon 3 times. He plays guitar, mandolin, and bass in the Jacob Swell Band, his church's worship band. He enjoys all kinds of sports, cooking, reading, traveling, and most of all, seeing people experience spiritual growth. We are very excited to have you with us this evening, Reverend Jack. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. It's great to be with you all. And I just am excited that we can spend time talking about change in the church and talking about how to deal with anxiety. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see my opening slide. And when I'm talking about anxiety, I am not talking about clinical anxiety. Clinical anxiety is something that, of course, is very serious, can be debilitating, requires professional treatment. What I'm talking about is the kind of anxiety that tends to get us stuck, tends to keep us focusing on things that detract us from the mission of God. And unfortunately, anxiety is one of the things that keeps people stuck and keeps churches stuck. And I use this slide to kind of juxtapose the paradox between who we are as church people who have a faith in that belongs in stories, that comes from stories that are thousands of years old. And at the same time, we're living in a day when everything is changing so rapidly. And I probably read my Bible on a device more often than I read it out of a book anymore. And this slide I started using even before the pandemic, and think about what we're doing now in worship and how we are gathering people electronically in ways that we couldn't have even thought of even 20 months ago. And so change is happening whether we like it or not. And the question is, how do we embrace it and how do we make it lasting? How do we make it effective and lasting? As Deb mentioned, one of the books I wrote is Anxious Church, Anxious People, How to Lead Change in an Age of Anxiety. And this came out in 2018, just as we were kind of leading up to what we all thought was going to fix our United Methodist Church, and that was General Conference 2019. And of course, we know that didn't even come close. In fact, it created even more chaos and anxiety and consternation. And here we are 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, and we're still in that time of uncertainty. So the denomination itself is going through this intense period of uncertainty and anxiety about where we will be headed in the future. And what we need is we need leaders who are able to remain a non-anxious presence. And the best way for me to define a non-anxious presence is by defining what it's not first. So a non-anxious presence is not a non-anxious non-presence. A non-anxious non-presence is laid back, maybe even aloof. And that's really because they are not that emotionally connected. It's easy to be non-anxious when maybe you really don't even care that much about other people. And that tends to be my default mode. If I'm going to lean in one direction or the other, I'm going to tend to be a non-anxious non-presence where, yeah, I'm easygoing, but I'm not really that connected emotionally. And I'm better at it now. I've worked at it for over 30 years. But one thing that's helped me to understand that this was my default mode was when my kids were young. My 4 kids are now grown. The youngest is 29. But when my kids were young, they used to call me by my first name, Jack. And it wasn't because we were one of those, what I remember as hippie families where the kids grew up calling their parents by their first names. It was because they would try to get my attention, and they would say, Dad, Dad, Dad. And finally they'd say, Jack. And they knew when they'd say Jack that I would look up. And I'm not proud of that. I've got issues, but the fact that I was not as emotionally connected as I need to be made it easier for me to be non-anxious, but I wasn't as present as I should have been. At the other end of the spectrum is an anxious presence. So an anxious presence is somebody who is so emotionally connected that they can't help but be anxious about how somebody else is functioning. And this is really easy as a parent. If you've ever been anxious about how your children are performing, either in school or in a relationship or in a job, you probably know what an anxious presence feels like. And the problem is that when you start to act on that, when you start to overfunction, when you start to try to make things right for them, you're actually getting too involved. You're not letting them learn how to grow and be themselves and even to learn from their mistakes. So an anxious presence is so emotionally connected that they're not able to let others be themselves. And this is really key because oftentimes in the church, we tend to be an anxious presence. The non-anxious non-presence, they're not as hard to deal with. But in the church, when you have an anxious presence, somebody who cares so much about the congregation or cares so much about, they're worried so much about the decline in attendance and giving that they are extremely anxious and they try to overfunction, then it creates problems. And oftentimes the overfunctioning is in trying to go back in time to where things were instead of thinking about how to move forward to God's preferred future for our church. So understanding how to be a non-anxious presence is really important. And the way that looks, the way I see that in leaders is that leaders who are a non-anxious presence are able to say what they believe in a healthy way, in a non-anxious way, while giving others the freedom to disagree. And think about how countercultural that is today. Think about how radical that is, that you might be able to express what you believe, but you don't need to convince the other to agree with you. But that's really what a non-anxious presence is able to do. And the reason that's important is because it avoids what is called a conflict of wills. A conflict of wills is like this picture. It's like a tug of war, right? Where each is trying to bring the other over to her or his side. And each is trying to convince the other that they are right and the other is wrong. And this conflict of wills comes from our own need to be right. We believe we're right, but we also need to have that rightness affirmed by having others agree with us. Non-anxious leaders don't have that need to be right. They have the conviction, they have that peace that surpasses understanding. They have the sense that this is where God is leading. And so they believe that they are right and they don't need others to affirm them. So they don't need to convince others to come over to their side. Another thing about the conflict of wills is that it actually results in the opposite. If you're trying to convince somebody who disagrees with you that you are right and they are wrong, it not only will not work, it will make things worse. The research shows us that people will actually entrench their position when you get in a conflict of wills. So the most important part about saying what you believe while giving others the freedom to disagree is knowing that if you try to get them to agree with you, it won't work. So what do you do then? You give them the freedom to disagree. Don't argue with them. You don't have to agree with them, but just don't get into the conflict of wills. And we'll unpack that as we go through tonight. But I think it's important to understand this idea that as a leader, if you're trying to lead change, it's important to say what you believe. This is what I believe, where I believe God is leading us. This is what I believe will help us to achieve the mission of Jesus Christ in the world. You can say that without requiring others to agree with you. And there's a reason for this, and it has to do with this understanding the conflict of wills. And I like to use this picture of a garage. This is not my garage. It actually looks better than my garage to illustrate the point. My garage is not a place where you can park cars. It's a place where I put stuff. And over time, it will just get more overloaded with stuff. And then every once in a while, I'll go in, I'll clean it out, I'll organize it, make everything, to throw stuff out and make it look great. And then, of course, over time, it starts to get worse and worse and worse, and I have to do it again. Well, one time about 15 years ago, I was doing dishes one morning on a Saturday morning, and I didn't have anything on my schedule, which is kind of unusual. And I said to myself, I'm going to clean out the garage today. And I was getting the resolve. This is the day I'm going to do that. And my wife walks by, and she wasn't even snarky or anything, but she kind of looked at me and she said, you need to clean out the garage. Well, as soon as she said that, it was like, I don't want to do that. And I realized nobody likes to be told what to do. As leaders, we need to understand that nobody likes to be told what to do. When we tell people what they have to do, it demotivates them. And I told you I had issues. And yeah, I had issues. I'm like, well, that was my idea. I'm in my head. That was my idea. I was going to do it myself. Now she's telling me to do it. I'm not doing it. And so I didn't do it. I'm sorry, I have issues. But nobody likes to be told what to do. So as a leader, we have to find different ways. If we're going to lead change, if we're going to help people follow God into the future, we may believe we know where that is, but we have to find a different way than just telling people that this is what you need to do. This is how you need to do it. So what does that look like? Well, part of it starts with this concept of self-differentiation. This is a family systems concept. Most of the work I do in leading change is based on family systems theory, which was developed by Murray Bowen, and Rabbi Edwin Friedman wrote Generation to Generation Family Process in Church and Synagogue, and to apply family systems theory to the congregational context. I think one of the most valuable works that has been done to help the church. I encountered it back in 1991 in my first semester of seminary, and have been studying it and learning more about it and applying it ever since. And it's these principles that have helped me to understand how we can lead effective and lasting change. So the idea of self-differentiation is that you as a person understand who you are and what you believe, your life's goals and values. And you can do that. You can define yourself. You can even express yourself in healthy ways in the midst of surrounding togetherness pressure. Surrounding togetherness pressure is this pressure to conform to the norms of the system around you. And the most basic system is our family of origin. That's our nuclear family, our aunts and uncles, our cousins, our parents, our aunts and uncles and cousins, our grandparents. In any family of origin, there are these unwritten rules that create norms. And every family system is different, but every family system has norms. Congregational systems also have norms. And that's why it's really important to understand that there are these unwritten rules, these unspoken things that cause people to want to create pressure so that we conform to the will of the group. The way I like to explain surrounding togetherness pressure is to understand how holidays work in families. Every family celebrates holidays differently, and typically neither are right or wrong. It's just different. For example, I have a Christmas tree here. When I was a kid, we were one of the first families in our neighborhood to have a fake Christmas tree. And it was ugly. It didn't hardly even look like a tree. This was back in the 1960s and early 70s. And but we, every December, early in December, we would haul down the box out of the attic. We would assemble the tree. Over the month, we would get presents in the mail. We put them under the tree, and then Christmas Eve we'd go to sleep, and Santa Claus would come and put more presents under the tree, and we wake up on Christmas morning, and lots of presents. Santa had come. Well, my best friend Jamie Dodd, who lived across the street, first of all, they didn't have a fake tree; they had a real tree. They didn't buy it until like 2 or 3 days before Christmas, and then they leaned it up against the back of their house. And Jamie and his sister and brother would go to sleep on Christmas Eve. It was still sitting by the back of the house, and then Santa Claus would bring the tree in, would set it up, would decorate it, and would put all the presents under the tree. And I wondered, how does Santa Claus have time to do that at Jamie's house? But we got to set up our own dumb fake Christmas tree. And then my friend Mike Ansell, who ended up being my best man, he was one of 4 kids. They all got up on Christmas morning. They went to bed, nothing happened under the tree. They get up on Christmas morning, they would come downstairs, and there would be 4 piles of presents, all unwrapped. And each pile was for one of the kids. And he told me that I've never experienced it, but he said it's the most amazing thing because you see all your presents at once. It's like overload, and you're so excited. And I'm like, well, that's not Christmas. You're not unwrapping presents. And those are just 3 examples from my childhood. Which of them is right and which is wrong? None of them. They're different. And that's how surrounding togetherness pressure works. They're unwritten rules in each congregational and family of origin system that dictate how people are supposed to act. If you see this other picture here, you kind of have to be old enough to remember what those are. Those are punch cards. Punch cards were how I grew up learning how to program a computer. And surrounding togetherness pressure, these unwritten rules are like software. They dictate how we react to certain situations automatically without thinking. So, for example, you might have in some houses there might actually be plastic over all the furniture, right? Because people never sit there. And in other houses, people sit on their furniture, and not only do people sit on their furniture, but dogs sit there too. And if you were from the house with the plastic and you went into the house where their dogs were sitting on the furniture, you'd be like, what is going on there? You would react automatically and say, that's dumb, that's wrong, what's wrong with you? That's what happens in systems, especially in congregational systems, when we start to encounter things that are different than what we believe, and we react. And that's where a lot of the anxiety comes in our congregations right now, because they're looking backward to the glory days of the Christian church, when everybody went to church because they were supposed to. People didn't miss church because they had other commitments. They had Sunday schools that were full, they had youth groups that were full. Giving was sufficient not only to take care of the programs, but to take care of the church building. And they have a certain idea of what church is supposed to be. And what's happening now is it's not conforming, and it's creating anxiety. And then on top of that, if a leader in the church says, I think if we could actually revitalize the church, if we focused on meeting the needs in our community of those who are most in need, that sounds even more radical. It creates even more anxiety, and it creates this pressure to conform, this surrounding togetherness pressure. So what is a leader to do? So the idea of leadership through self-differentiation. Remember, self-differentiation as a leader is the ability to define your own goals and values in the midst of this surrounding togetherness pressure. So the idea is that if you will just take responsibility for yourself, this is what I believe God is leading us to do. This is where I think God is leading us to go. If you're able to just take responsibility for that and communicate that clearly while staying in touch emotionally with the rest of the people in the system, in the congregational system, there is a good chance that people will follow. And there will be initial resistance. But if you can stay in touch emotionally with the resistors, the body will usually go along. And I've seen this happen over and over again. What happens is there is resistance, and what we want to do is we want to withdraw from the resistors, and we want to kind of band together with the people who are in agreement with us. This is where we need to go. But actually, if we disconnect emotionally from the resistance, from the resistors, we are more likely to cause anxiety. They're likely to increase their own anxiety and to dysfunction even more, to dig in and to really try to stop their whatever change is going on. So just remember this idea of staying emotionally connected with those who are resisting the change that is happening. And I'll try to give some examples as I go along here. I want to give an example, though, of somebody who led through self-differentiation and impacted an entire nation, right? That's Dr. King. And if you look at how Dr. King spoke, he self-differentiated. He talked about his own goals and values. I have a dream, right? He talks about where he thinks God wants, the arc of justice, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, right? He is helping people to see what is possible based on what he believes, without actually telling other people, you have to agree with me. Remember, he didn't influence change by telling people who disagreed with him what they had to do. He influenced change by staying focused on where he believed God was leading and inspiring those who wanted to go along. And our role as leaders is to focus more on that inspiration. And as people resist, to love them, to care about them, to show that we treat them as human beings and respect them in that same way, but not necessarily to give in to them. I think that's what Dr. King did. It cost him his life, but I also think he made a tremendous amount of change that others were not able to do by trying to convince them that they were right and the others were wrong. So what does leadership through self-differentiation look like? There's two components. One is self-definition, and the other is emotional connection. Self-definition is just saying what you believe. It's claiming your own goals and values. So as you think about the future of your own congregation, as you think about the future of your annual conference, where do you believe God is leading? What do you think God is calling you to do to make a difference in the world for Jesus Christ? That, as a leader, that's what self-definition is. It's helping people to understand what you think should be done. The emotional connection part is this idea that you show others that you care about them, even as you disagree, that you don't argue with them, you don't agree with them, but you show you care about them. And this is really, really hard to do, but I want to give an example that I think really helps to understand that. So in a church I was serving, it was the first Christmas Eve that I was there as the new pastor. We were going to do a different kind of Christmas Eve service. This was back in 1996. We decided we were going to do a dramatic reading of the Christmas story. So it was a reader's theater, and we had 4 young adults dressed in black. Well, they were probably close to 50, but that was considered a young adult. They were dressed in black on bar stools with music stands, and they were going to do a reader's theater of the Christmas story. I thought it was exciting. I thought, well, this is a way to reach people who maybe don't want churchy stuff. It certainly wasn't the lessons of lessons and carols, service of lessons and carols. So I walk into the church 15 minutes before the service is supposed to start, and I get accosted by a woman in the church who just lays into me saying, this is not what she imagines Christmas Eve is. It's not a Christmas Eve service for her. She didn't know what I was thinking. She was all over me, letting me know how bad this was. And part of avoiding the conflict of wills and part of being able to self-define is to just say, you know, I care about you, but I didn't want to actually defend the service itself, because I knew that if I said, well, that if we're going to reach people who don't really know Jesus, we need to do things differently. Well, we would have just gotten into a conflict, right? So I had to focus more on the emotional connection side and just say, thank you for sharing. You know, I can always count on you to tell me how you feel. So then she walks away. You know, we didn't get into it there. There wasn't time for it, and I wasn't going to get into it. And I went and I asked our lay leader, you know, is everything okay with this woman? And as it turns out, I found out that she had lost her daughter, who was in her early 20s. Her daughter had died about 2 years prior at Christmas. Okay, so what was going on was it wasn't about the Christmas Eve service at all, right? It was about her grief and her being upset at Christmas, and the Christmas Eve service was an easy target. So by not arguing with her and not agreeing, I was able to then contact her the following week. And I went to see her, and I just asked her, I said, I heard your daughter died a couple of years ago. How are you doing? You know, just emotional connection, just being there and caring. And guess what? The Christmas Eve service never came up. This wasn't about the Christmas Eve service at all. This was about her own feelings of pain and anxiety over the fact that she had lost her daughter a couple of years earlier. And I think that's an important thing to understand. Many, many times when people are acting up in the church or in any system, there's something else going on in them, and they're taking it out on the pastor, or they're taking it out on the service, or they're taking it out on the choir director. You know, they're finding any number of ways to unleash their own anxiety. That's why any kind of change is an easy target, because they may be uncomfortable with something else in their life, and they're going to take it out on the change. And what that is called is that's called an emotional triangle. An emotional triangle is formed. It can be three persons, but there can also be issues involved too. But when any two parts of the triangle become uncomfortable with one another, they will focus on a third person or issue as a way to stabilize their own relationship with one another. So this example I just gave, think about this. The woman, okay, is uncomfortable with the loss of her daughter. So the two sides of the triangle are basically the woman and her grief. She is uncomfortable with her grieving. And so what does she do? She focuses on the third, on a third issue, which is the Christmas Eve service. And she blames the Christmas Eve service. And I'm going to use a statement. You probably understand what it is. This is what I like to call kicking the dog, right? So if you have a bad day at work and you really have a problem with your boss, but you're uncomfortable with speaking up for yourself with your boss, and you go home and you get mad at your dog, you kick the dog. Please don't kick the dog, but you know what I mean? That's a triangle, right? You're taking it out on that third side. And the reason is because we're not able to stand up for ourselves in healthy ways. And so we find another way to take that out. So some typical triangles can be substance abuse. So that third side, that substance abuse is the third side of a triangle. Typically, a substance abuser has some unresolved issues with some of the relationships, and instead of dealing with those issues, they actually focus on substance. Or they get addicted to a substance, and despite the fact that this might be a genetic disposition, the abuse of the substance is used to avoid dealing with the uncomfortable relationship. And For example, let's say that there's two spouses and one of them starts drinking because they're uncomfortable in their relationship with their spouse. And the other spouse, what do? Well, they start saying, you're drinking too much. You got to stop drinking. The focus becomes on the drinking instead of on their relationship and working through their relationship. Triangles are pervasive in any system. And that's because most times we don't deal with relationships in the healthy way. We don't deal with them directly. And what we will find in congregational systems is that people are going to triangle all the time. So when people start complaining about the speed of the hymns, or when they start complaining about the Sunday school superintendent, or when they start complaining about the pastor, oftentimes this is a triangle, and it can come from one of two places. I typically will ask, if I'm coaching a leader, I will say, what's going on in their own family of origin? Oftentimes there's something going on in their own family of origin, and they're bringing it into the church by triangling something in the church. Or what's going on in the church? Or do they have an issue with somebody else and they're triangling this? The reason that triangling is important is because that is often how people will try to undermine effective change. So what will happen is if you are, let's say you're leading an initiative to work with the homeless in your community, and you believe that's going to make a difference in the community, and that will help you connect with other people in the community who also believe that taking care of the homeless is important. And well, they may or may not come to church, they may or may not want to know more about Jesus, but it's a way to help revitalize the church. And let's say that the church council votes overwhelmingly for it, but in reality, what often happens in situations like this is the people who are most uncomfortable with that don't speak up. They go along, and you get them to agree. But now, as you're trying to actually implement the change, they start to act up. They're starting to get uncomfortable, and very seldom do they actually try to they actually speak up about the change itself, about the homeless ministry. What ends up happening is what is called sabotage, and this is a form of triangle. So let's say that the homeless ministry is moving forward and they're uncomfortable with it, and so they start complaining about the lay leader, or they start complaining about the pastor. And what it does is it creates negative energy, where then the leaders in the church have to try to appease this person who's complaining, and it undermines the change that's taking place. I like to use an example of personal change that it helps to emphasize this idea of sabotage, because sabotage is not witting. If people actually were wittingly trying to undermine something, I think that would be more evil. But sabotage is something, it's just because people don't know how to deal with the fact their own discomfort. They don't know how to deal with the change. They're feeling anxious, and they're looking for an outlet for that anxiety. And so it comes out in this unwitting triangling and criticism and undermining that draws energy away from the positive change. And the example I like to give is, let's say that you decided, I'm going to get healthier, and you start exercising regularly, and you've been doing this for 3, 4, 5, 7 weeks, and it's really going well. You're really feeling good about yourself, and you would think that let's just say your father in this case, you would think that your father would be really positive about that, and outwardly he is. But for some reason, he's uncomfortable with this positive change in you. And if you've ever experienced anything like this in your family of origin, you know what I'm talking about. For some reason, people are uncomfortable when others in the system have positive improvements. So what does your father do? Well, he starts saying, you need to talk to your brother about the fact that he never comes home for Christmas, or you need to talk to your brother about the fact that he's not calling me enough, or whatever. It could be anything, but the idea is that your father is unwittingly, unknowingly triangling you because he's uncomfortable with the positive developments in your life. And if you're like I am, you don't really want to have to call your father about, or your brother about, something that's your dad's problem with him. And it creates anxiety. And all of a sudden that anxiety causes you to maybe not feel as motivated to get up in the morning and exercise. It's those types of ways that people unwittingly throw off positive change, whether that's personal change or congregational change. So understanding that this is a part of the process. In fact, Edwin Friedman, in Generation to Generation, says that if you're not experiencing sabotage, you're not really leading, because you haven't really created the kind of change that creates the discomfort where sabotage occurs. I'm not sure that's always the case, but I would say that as a leader, if you are trying to lead positive change, you want to be prepared for the sabotage. You want to be prepared for the fact that people are going to have discomfort and they're not going to know how to handle it, and it's going to come out in dysfunctional ways. And the most important thing that you can do as a leader is not get in an argument with them. Remember, not getting that conflict of wills, but stay emotionally connected. Remember that leadership through self-differentiation is the ability to stay focused on where you're headed, but at the same time, stay connected to those who are most resistant. And if you do that, you will be able to stay the course and actually make change a positive thing. I was working with a pastor in a church, and one of the things they decided to do was they decided to move the early service up by 15 minutes and move the late service back by 15 minutes so that they would have time in the center between the two services for an adult Sunday school. They had, over time, they had gotten to where they just had children's Sunday school and they didn't have a time for adult Sunday school, and they felt like it was important for adults to have that time if they wanted to grow as disciples. So they did everything right. They did the survey, and they did town hall meetings to communicate what that was being planned, and the church council voted for it overwhelmingly. But probably 2 weeks before the service, the change was going to occur, they started to hear rumblings. Now, in this case, the sabotage was focused on the service itself, but people were saying, I'm not sure. There are some people who are not on board with this, and you know that anonymous some people. You know, whenever some people, you hear somebody come to you and they say some people are saying, but you don't know really who. It was that kind of thing, and we met with the leadership team, and I encouraged them, just go to those people who are telling you this, and express what you believe, and show that you care about them, but stay focused on where you're headed. Remain a non-anxious presence. And that's what they did. They said, you know, I know you're concerned about this. I know you're worried it might not work, but I believe this is where God is leading us. I believe it's going to make a difference. And that's what they did. The grumblings didn't necessarily recede, but they moved forward. And on the Sunday that they made the change, 25 people showed up for adult Sunday school. That was about 25% of their worshiping congregation. They had about 100 on a Sunday. So pretty significant percentage of the congregation showing up for Sunday school. And they maintained that throughout that fall. So the idea of being able to stay focused on where you're headed, remaining a non-anxious presence, and being able to remain connected to those who feel most anxious is the way through, but it's a difficult way through, because what we want to do is we want to just back off and say, well, maybe we should just wait. And that's what people were saying in that church. Maybe we should just let's give it some time and see if this is really the right thing. But that is just a natural part of the change process, and their willingness to remain a non-anxious presence enabled them to go through with it and to seek effective and lasting change. This raises the idea that a lot of times what's going on has more to do with the emotional process and not the content of the discussion. So many times people are going to kind of draw us in to a discussion about something that really is a red herring. It's trying to draw us away from where their real discomfort is. And in the case of the woman on Christmas Eve, the content was her grief, right? It wasn't the service itself. I mean, the process was her grief. The content was the service itself. And by recognizing there was an emotional process going on, that she was anxious, she was triangling, that it was, we don't want to get in a conversation about content with her because we'll get stuck. It enabled us to avoid that. So when people are really anxious and up in arms, when they're blaming, when they're trying to tell you what you were doing wrong, that's an emotional process sign that something else is going on in them. And you don't want to get in that conflict of wills. Don't argue, don't agree. Avoid trying to convince them that you are right and they are wrong. Avoid getting into the content of the situation. Instead, just thank them for sharing. Help them to understand that you do care about what they think, that you know that they're concerned, but that you also believe that God is calling you to move in a certain direction. That raises the importance of vision, because vision is self-definition. If we talk about leadership through self-differentiation being both self-definition and emotional connection, then vision is the ability to say, this is where I believe we should be going. This is where I believe God is leading. And I think it's important to understand that I believe in terms of people of faith, vision is not knowing the entire path. It's only knowing the direction. It's only knowing the direction that God is calling us. And I like to think of Abram, when he was called from his homeland, God didn't tell him where he was going. God just said, go to the land that I will show you. He just said, start going, start walking, pick up everything you have and start going. And I believe that's how vision is for people of faith. It's like this foggy road, right? If you were to wait until you could see the entire road, you would never go. But instead, what God calls you to do is to move forward. And as you move forward, you'll see a little farther. And as you move forward, you'll see a little farther. And vision like that for the church is the same. As you move forward, you will see a little further. And your job as a leader is to articulate that vision, to say, this is what I believe the next step should be. This is what I believe the next step should be, and continue to make progress and remain a non-anxious presence. Okay, just a couple more slides and then we'll open it up for questions. So one thing that is helpful to understand this conflict of wills is the idea of the leverage of the dependent. So dependent people are people who are always trying to get you to agree with them. They need you to agree with them. They need you to do what they want. They need you to take care of their needs. And the reason the dependent have leverage is that we're either always trying to appease them or we're always trying to get them to agree with us and move in the direction we want to go, we believe God is calling. And when we do that, it's like this picture. We're pulling on a rope and the dependent are holding us back. Instead, if the leader is willing to let go of that rope, if the leader is willing to no longer engage in a conflict of wills with the dependent, and will just start walking in the direction that she or he or they believe, then that creates pressure on the dependent to either decide to follow or not. And the dependent don't want to make a decision for themselves. What they want to do is they want to keep us stuck, and they want to keep arguing with us to keep the system stuck. They like the way things are now, and they don't want to change. So the choice you have as a leader is to stay in this conflict with the dependent and keep trying to convince them to follow you. Or you can decide to move forward whether they want to or not, and that actually creates pressure on them. Now, will you lose some people? Perhaps, but that's better than having them keep you in a position of stuckness in the congregation. And one of the ways to think about this is to understand that when they give you an ultimatum, when they tell you that you have to do something to keep them along with you, they have you stuck. And the only way to unstick is to be free of that, to not be dependent on their decision. When I was going into one of my appointments back in the 90s, I have an earring. I've had an earring since 1995, and my take-in for this appointment, the district superintendents told the SPRC, your new pastor has an earring. Well, one of the women in the room just went ballistic. She was like, well, we're not having a pastor with an earring, and if we have a pastor with an earring, I'm leaving and going to another church. And one of the matriarchs of the church, who was one of the most non-anxious presences I ever knew, and who is now in heaven with God, she looked at this woman who was upset and said, well, we'll miss you. That is being free of the leverage of the dependent, right? That is being willing to say, okay, you have a choice. You have the freedom to disagree. You have the freedom to leave if you want. It's okay. We still care about you. If you want to go with our blessing. Notice the difference between that and a leader who is stuck trying to convince the dependent people that they need to agree with them. This is one of the key components of leadership through self-differentiation is truly giving people the freedom to disagree and being able to live with it. If we are not able to live with it, if we start acting as if we need them and we have to please them, then we are stuck in the leverage of the dependent. Along with this is this idea of the concept of pain and responsibility. Because if we are not willing to let other people experience their own pain, they will never take responsibility for themselves. If we're always trying to help alleviate other people from their own pain, they won't take responsibility, and then they've got us stuck. I use an example in my book of one of my early years in ministry. We had the woman who was doing the church newsletter decided she was going to resign after something like 16 years doing it. And it was nothing personal or anything. She was just tired and had some family obligations. And nobody stepped up to take over the newsletter. And that went on for 6 months. It went on month after month, and we didn't have a church newsletter. I was a student pastor at the time. I had 3 kids, and my 4th was on the way. And I just wasn't going to volunteer to do the newsletter. But people would come up to me and say, boy, I sure miss the newsletter. And I don't know if you recognize that as being surrounding togetherness pressure, but what they were really saying is, you need to do something about the newsletter. And they were experiencing the pain in the newsletter, and I was experiencing that too. And what I was able to do, I think really, I don't think I was that smart, but I think I just was able to do was say, yeah, I miss the newsletter too. So if I tried to alleviate them experiencing the pain of not having a newsletter, they would have never taken responsibility for it. If I would have just said, oh, well, I'll do the newsletter for now, I probably would have been doing the news. I'd probably still be doing it. You know, it's allowing other people to experience their own pain is the way that people actually learn to take responsibility for self. If you raise children, right, you know this. You know, how many times is that kid going to touch a hot stove? Once, maybe twice, probably not more than that. But if we keep telling the kid not to do it and pulling their arm back, they're going to resent us. they're not even going to know anything about the stove. And I think that's a good example of, in leading in the church, we have to be willing to let other people experience their own pain, whatever that might be, whether it has to do with something in their own family of origin, whether it has to do with their discomfort with what's going on in the church, but at the same time, stay connected emotionally. Show that we care about them, but would not be stuck in that conflict of wills, not allow them to maintain their dependence on us and have leverage on us. Okay, how do you maintain a non-anxious presence? Well, the first thing is to self-regulate. So part of the problem that we have as leaders is we almost always have an automatic response to the anxiety of others. And that usually is not the response that we want. It usually gets us being defensive or getting argumentative, trying to justify what we think God is calling us to do. And so just being able to pause and stop and think and say, what do I need to do here? How can I avoid a conflict of wills? How can I maintain a non-anxious presence? And the best way to maintain a non-anxious presence is to listen. If you can just listen to other people and be genuinely curious about what they believe and feel, you will actually be non-anxious, more non-anxious, and you will definitely be emotionally present. By definition, listening shows emotional presence. And the best way to do this is by asking what the so-called reporter questions: who, what, when, where, and how. So how often do you feel this way? What makes you feel this way? Tell me more about this. These are all questions that are just open-ended and allow people to share their feelings. Sometimes they just need to vent, and that's going to be it. Other times, they're not going to be satisfied with that, but at least you've been able to be a non-anxious presence with them. And then if they are pressing you to say, well, what do you believe? What are you going to do about that? Say what you believe, but give them the freedom to disagree. And I have a few statements that I like to keep in my pocket for something like this. I may be wrong, but this is what I believe. Okay, so by admitting that you may be wrong, that you don't necessarily know you're right, because you don't, right? We never necessarily know if we're right. This is just what we believe. But by saying I may be wrong, we create enough emotional space to try to avoid that conflict of wills. Another is, you don't have to agree with me, but this is what I believe, right? And then another is, well, this might not work. And this, I think this is a really important one, because acknowledging that it might not work is an important thing for a leader to do, and being vulnerable, because leaders have to understand that all we're doing is we're trying what we think is best, and it might not work. And we can say this might not work, but if it doesn't, I believe we can learn some valuable things. So having statements like that help you to say what you believe while giving others the freedom to disagree. So first step, self-regulate. Just don't say what automatically comes to mind, because that's usually going to increase the anxiety and the intensity of the situation and make things worse. You typically get defensive or argumentative, or you'll just give in and just not say anything. And that's not good either, because you want to be able to stand up for what you believe in as a leader. So first, self-regulate. Second, listen. And then third, if you need to, after you say thank you for sharing and they're still pressing you, say what you believe while giving others the freedom to disagree. And how do we get better at this? Well, the way I found that leaders get better at this is by doing their own work. And if you don't recognize this is a genogram of, I don't even know the name. It's Ben Solo. He's Luke Skywalker's son in Star Wars. This is a genogram of the Star Wars family. But you notice some of the this diagram, it shows kind of disconnected red dotted lines. This shows very much closeness. The jagged line is conflict. And what a genogram does, a genogram is like a family tree, but it helps us to understand the relationships and how these patterns of anxiety and patterns of reactivity get passed on from generation to generation, and what is going on inside of us. And as we learn more about this, we learn whatever the relationships in our family of origin that make us the most anxious. And I like to define them as the ones where if you see a text or an email or a voicemail from that person, your blood pressure and your anxiety shoot way up. They're the ones that somehow you have a hard time being a non-anxious presence with. Either you give in all the time or you're always fighting. And if you can rework those relationships in your family of origin so that you can be a non-anxious presence, you can self-differentiate, you can say what you believe in healthy ways to them, it will increase your capability, your capacity to do so in every other situation you're in, especially in the church. So doing your own work is learning how to self-differentiate by doing so first in your family of origin. And you can do that by finding a therapist, somebody who is trained in family systems, the family systems approach. You can do it by getting in a cohort of like-minded people who want to work through family systems theory together and talk about their own families of origin. You can do it by getting in a coaching relationship with somebody who does family systems work. But it's worth looking at in terms of doing your own work, because if you want to be a non-anxious presence, if you want to be able to lead change in a healthy way, I find there's nothing better than doing this kind of work. And the way I like to describe it is, as Soren Kierkegaard says, it helps us to become ourselves. It helps us to become the person that God intends us to be. So to me, this is the essence of self-differentiation. You're not trying to be anybody else than the person that God intends you to be. And it only happens by the grace of God, but it happens through the kind of work that enables us to get in touch with who we really are and how we can self-differentiate. And then last slide is just a quick shameless plug for 2 of the 3 books. The Anxious Church, Anxious People is the one I based this presentation on. If you met my family, you'd understand is more one that's just general family systems. It was one that my wife said I needed to write just because she felt like family systems theory helps people who aren't even trying to lead in the church. And then I have a weekly podcast on, it's mostly on this type of approach to being a non-anxious leader. And you can find out about all of that at the nonanxiousleader.com. That is my shameless plug. So I'm done, and now I'm going to open it up for any questions or comments.
Do you find it difficult? Because I feel that we live in a culture where people don't like pain, and the responsibility we're talking about, it's easier to go to the anxiousness. And so how do we deal with that culture in our congregations?
Yeah, so the best way to, according to family systems theory at least, the best way to increase our own pain threshold, the best way to increase our threshold for the pain of others is to increase our own pain threshold. And what that means is we get more in touch with who we are, who God is calling us to be. If you've ever you've really been motivated for anything, like a goal, like training to do a race or working to get a degree or whatever, you know that the more motivated we are, the higher our pain threshold is, right? The more we're able to tolerate our own pain. And by increasing our own pain threshold, we increase our threshold for the pain of others. So part of that is really being focused on the goal for the congregation. Believing so strongly, if we really believe strongly that this is where God is leading us, then that becomes more important, right? Than the fact that some people are uncomfortable or some people are being needy and dysfunctioning. And yeah, we want to care about them, we want to connect with them, but we can remind ourselves that we can't fix them. This is something going on with them. And all we can do is show our care, but they're going to have to deal with it.
There's a question from Kim. She says, any suggestions for how to pull back once you've engaged and have become stuck?
Again, this goes back to the idea of self-differentiating. And one of the ways to put self-differentiation is to take responsibility for yourself and only yourself. And so, kind of when you're engaged, you've tried to take responsibility for somebody else. You've tried to define them instead of just defining yourself. And so one way I would suggest, because remember, this is process, not content. The content could be anything. You can go to them and you can say, I've been thinking about the conflict that we've been having, and I don't want to do that anymore. And I don't feel like we need to agree, and I still respect you as a person. And notice how you're only saying who you are, what you think. You're not saying anything to them. And you can say, you can even say, I hope that we can move forward in a different way. You can even say something like, perhaps I'm willing to not discuss this anymore if we don't need to. As long as you're defining yourself, as long as you're saying this is what I would like to see happen, while at the same time not putting pressure on them to agree with you, I think you give it a chance. And usually when complaining and conflict is actually a form of pursuit. Okay, this kind of stuff doesn't happen with people who don't care about you or don't care about the church. And so when you get engaged in this, remind yourself that there's deep caring that's going on, and it's just people they don't know how to handle it in a healthy way. So by saying to them, I really don't want to do this anymore, or I'm worried this is going to impact our relationship in the long term. And if you can take responsibility and say, I'm sorry, I apologize for the things I've said. That's even better. Don't say if it's not true, but if you realize, I've said some hurtful things, I need to own up to them, and do that in the spirit of grace and forgiveness, right? Not requiring them to reciprocate. All you're doing is to just say who you are, what you believe, and then whatever they decide is fine. And quite honestly, sometimes they're going to just say, forget it, I'm done. And you know what my response would be? Well, I'm sad about that, but I understand. And what you're saying is, I'm sad. That's defining yourself. But you're you do you. And I just think right now in our society, people just aren't able to allow other people to be who they are. We just have to say, if you don't agree with me, there's something wrong with you. You're evil. And if we don't have leaders who can get us out of that, we're not going to make it through whatever happens when General Conference decides if it decides. But having leaders who can help people say, I want us to stay together, but I understand if you want to go, or I know you want us to stay together, but I have to go. We're going to have these conversations, and doing it in a healthy way is going to be more important than ever. So because we are nice church people, it seems not continuing to spend time. So I think you're saying because we're nice church people, we do spend time on the complainers, trying to appease them. Is that what you're saying? Because I think that's what I see is we spend way too much time with the complainers, right? Because we're nice people, right? And we don't want them to be in pain. But so often it's their own pain. I had a clergy colleague who the lay leader all of a sudden just started acting up and started complaining about everything she was doing. And so my colleague called me and I said to her, well, what's going on with your lay leader? Well, her older daughter's got married and her younger daughter's moving out of the house. And so automatically I understand life change, big transition, probably some grief going on over that. And this is a triangle. She's now focused on the pastor and complaining about the pastor because she's uncomfortable with what's going on in her own home, and it's not, these things happen all the time, right? We are always going through life changes and encountering challenges and struggles in our families that make us uncomfortable. But whenever somebody is starting to act up in the church, ask that question, what's going on with them? And so I just encourage my colleague, go connect with your lay leader, sit down with her, ask her how she's doing, how can I walk with you, show you care. And that's the way to deal with the complainers without actually dealing with their complaints, right? In fact, one of the other, I like to have all these sayings in my pocket, but one of them is, if you have a complainer like that and they're focused on you, right? And you know there's something else going on, you know it's not about you. If you can just say, at a certain point, say, enough about this, enough about me. How are you doing? What's going on with you? If you can get past that initial complaint and get to where somebody really is, you can then walk with them through their pain, not take their pain away, not help them avoid their pain, but walk with them through their pain. And what family systems theory predicts, and this, I've seen this happen over and over again, is when you walk with them through their pain, they become your biggest supporters as leaders. And so instead of being in perpetual conflict with them and dealing with their complaints, instead you help them actually deal with what's really going on with them, and they become allies. The woman I talked about whose daughter died at Christmas, she was one of those. I mean, she supported me for things when I was leading as a pastor, regardless. Now that's not right either, but it's better than her complaining all the time, right? So.
I have three things. What is the shameless advertising you did? That's the non-anxious what? What was the next part?
The NonAnxiousLeader.com. So it's all one word. Yeah, no hyphen either. Just the NonAnxiousLeader.com.
Okay, got it. And the lady that you just mentioned again in grief, I thoroughly understand. And that's a wonderful way to remind us to look at that. I can relate to her grief in that she was in the grief going into her comfortable spot to have things totally changed in her life and wanting to come to a place that was steadfast and comfortable. And she walked into a change. Bottom drops out. Now the life isn't the same and the church isn't the same. Yeah. So we can absolutely see that analogy. That's a good one.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Yes. And the other thing is right now with the decline from, I'm sure people getting used to services online and whatever, we're losing good leaders. And I gather a lot of things from your talk that we can try or do. But one of the things would be, what do you do with people when someone new comes up and say, I'd like to do that. I wouldn't mind being the Sunday lay leader or whatever it is. And the person says to them, oh, you don't want to do that. You have to do this and you have to do that. And I'm hiding my head because you don't turn people off that are willing. And some of the advice you're giving is ways to interject there. But that's a difficult thing because you're dealing with two people.
Yeah, and then in some ways you're getting involved in the triangle. If you
exactly.
If you try to tell the person who's discouraging to stop discouraging, you're going to get in a conflict of wills.
Yes.
But I think one thing you can do is say to the person that's stepping up, well, I have a different opinion. My experience has been right, and so again, being able to just say what you think, what you believe in a way without putting anybody else down. I think that's the most important thing. So if you can just share the positive view you have, and say, well, my experience is different, and again, these little ways we signal emotional space, my experience, right? This, not your experience, not this other person's experience, because maybe their experience was they got bogged down, but you know what? I'm going to guess that they probably couldn't say no either. They weren't able to set healthy boundaries, and again, that's their issue. We can't help them with that, but we can, if we can take responsibility for ourselves and express ourselves in healthy ways, you will be surprised how many people will also be able to do the same. The people who can't will that's always going to be kind of a source of negative energy. But there are many people in that middle who just don't speak up, right? Because they don't want to incur the wrath of the people who are stuck, and they're not seeing anybody else speak up in healthy ways. So we need leaders who are willing to be able to do that and to say, well, in my experience, it really has been wonderful. I've loved it. It's brought me energy, whatever. And you will see, especially if this person is always a naysayer, right? If other people see, oh, well, gosh, Ruth actually stood up and said something different than that naysayer, they're going to start doing it too. I've seen it. I've worked with many clergy and churches, and I've seen it over and over again. As soon as one person starts to stand up and does it in a healthy way, those who have the capacity to do it and have just been holding back actually have the courage to do it too.
Yes, I wish I had this class before that situation, but in that situation, I just told the woman offering to do the job, it's fine, you'll be fine, I'll help you. I'll be there for any questions or whatever. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But you've given a lot of good techniques too. Thank you.
So this is a question from Deb. Is everyone a part of the process? What if some cannot trust the process? Yeah, everybody is a part of the process. If they're involved in the congregational system, they are part of the process, whether they like it or not. And if some cannot trust the process, that they're going to be the ones who are going to be most resistant, probably the most anxious, and will be the ones likely to form some kind of sabotage, wittingly or unwittingly. And so, as a leader, I think it's wise to just expect that as a possibility. I think in most congregations, if I were to go up to the leadership and say, who's the person who's most likely to cause a ruckus if we make positive change, you probably already know who those people are. And again, complaining is a form of pursuit. It's not that they don't care. If they don't care, they just leave, or they wouldn't say anything. It's that they care so much and that they're not able to deal with their discomfort. And so what I always coach the leaders to do is move closer to them emotionally without engaging them in their complaints. And again, going back to kind of what I mentioned to Ruth, see if you can connect with them in ways, find out about their family, find out what's going on with them personally. Just show that you care about them, even as you stay focused on the change you're trying to create. And I think it's part and parcel of what goes on. It's rather than think it's not going to happen, just expect that, there's going to be some who aren't going to trust it. They're not going to be on board.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jack. We are so grateful for this presentation and for everything you've given us, things that we can put into action right away, and be non-anxious leaders. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.